Hello students, welcome to this most awaited session on this particular discussion on Anthropology paper 1. We would have this section being divided into two different parts, part 1 and part 2, so that the things can be made easy. In this particular discussion session, we would discuss that what should be the structure for the corresponding question, and we can also see that what are going to be the different thinkers that can be used in this particular question. And the third aspect is how can we make this answer dynamic, for the reason that most of the aspirants think that anthropology as a subject is very static. But you need to understand that though the syllabus appears to be static, but this subject is very dynamic in the context that every topic has an interrelation. Every topic has an interrelation, and every topic is interrelated. For the reason when we are talking about this interrelation, you have interrelation with respect to the topics of physical anthropology, you would have topics with respect to your socio-cultural anthropology. For example, if you talk about the rules of marriage, and when you talk about rules of marriage, it is very certain that the aspects of physical anthropology, for example, concepts like inbreeding, concepts like homozygosity, concepts like homozygosity suppression, all these are going to be interrelated. So we have to talk about this particular interrelation and see how things can be interrelated so that these questions can be made in a dynamic way. Now let's start off with the question. That the first question is debate between formalist and substantivist approach. And there's a very simple question, and in the sense that it is one of the most straightforward and expected questions from economic anthropology of chapter 3. And when you look at this particular question, the introduction could be simply that you can start what is your understanding on formalism as well as what is the understanding of substantivism. Or the other way is, simple way is, you can talk about the timeline with respect to what is the debate between the Karl Polanyi, what is the debate between the Raymond Firth, what is the debate that is existing with respect to the Malinowski. And you see the role of Karl Polanyi in trying to disseminate, in trying to resolve this particular debate, and in that particular debate he gives about what are the different approaches that are followed by these kinds of ideologies. And in his book called The Great Transformation, he talks about such approaches that are followed. And when you look at this particular question, you see that this debate was centered around three different aspects. It was all about whether a primitive man is an economic man or not. And on that basis, when you look at their approaches, it was either based on the principles of ISC, that is insufficiency, scarcity and choice. Or was it based on what is the type of the economy? And the third aspect that was based, that what is the nature of the market. Now these are the three aspects that were related to with respect to these approaches. And if you have to look at the necessary dynamism that is to be brought in this particular question, you can see that how can you relate this debate with respect to the changing tribal economy. Because when you try to understand the changing nature of tribal economy, once upon a time it was barter, now it is all dependent on money. It is all market driven. And when you look at this, you see these tribal entities as such, you see they are transitioning from a substantivist form of understanding to a formalist form of understanding. This can be done, and you can talk about that the tribal economy vis-a-vis what is the impact of globalization to bring in this dynamism with respect to its interlinkage from transition from substantivism to formalism. Right? This can be a simple approach for this question. And when you look at the second question, it is asking about the Mesolithic rock art in the Indian subcontinent. In this, you can simply introduce with the what is the time period with respect to the Mesolithic time art or Mesolithic rock art. Right, you can introduce it with the time period, that's around 10,000 BC to 7,000 BC. And apart from that, in the Indian subcontinent, the major areas are the Bhimbetka, the Adamgarh, the Pichavaram region. Right, so these are some of the important areas, and here you can talk about the various aspects of Mesolithic rock art. It might be with respect to what is the texture, or it might be the color combinations or the color usages, or it might be the nature of the cave art that is used, or it might be the nature of the petroglyphs that are generally found in this region. This can be one aspect. And if you want to still bring in a dynamism with respect to this aspect, because here the thinkers that you can use is your Carlyle's understanding of Mesolithic, for the reason it is a microlithic era. And you can talk about the observations of V.S. Wakankar that has been made in the context of the Bhimbetka region. And if you have to bring in dynamism with respect to this particular question, we can compare the Mesolithic art of the Indian subcontinent versus what is its status with respect to the European region. And when we look at this comparison, you see that there is so much of emphasis that is given to this Mesolithic art in the Indian subcontinent, not so much in European region. That can be one aspect of dynamism. And you can conclude it by saying that this Mesolithic as an era was a transition region. You see it to a transitionary region, right? Then moving to the third question, that is Radcliffe's Brown idea on status, role and institution. Now it is generally confused by the aspirants that the debate of status and role is generally given by one of the thinkers that you study in your cultural personality school, that is Ralph Linton. Ralph Linton's understanding of status and role debate. Now it is asking about Radcliffe Brown's ideas. Now that means aspirants might be confused, we didn't study about the Radcliffe Brown's ideas, but you need to understand that this question is nothing but a decoded version of the structural functionalism that you study in chapter 6. It is a decoded version of the structural functionalism that you study in chapter 6 as part of your Radcliffe Browns. There, what happens is you see that a social system, a social organization, and a social function continues to exist there. As they are existing, social structure, function, and organization. You see that there is an interrelation that is existing between all these three elements, and you see that this particular theory of structural functionalism of R.C. Brown is derived from the Emile Durkheim's concept of organic solidarity. And with this understanding, you can say that status is nothing but a static part of the individual's understanding. Role happens to be a dynamic part, whereas your institution happens to exist. Now here, as a subject matter of understanding apart from your thematic discussion, you can talk about the impact of feminism. Impact of feminism on family as a social institution. And when we see this impact of feminism on family as a social institution, we see that the status, the role and the institution as such changing. This happens to be one interlinkage that we can get, because in your syllabus you study that there is an interrelation that is existing, or they talk about the impact of urbanization, impact of industrialization, impact of feminism on family. So that interrelation we can bring in here. And moving on to the next question, that pedigree analysis in genetic counseling. And here we can talk about what is the Harper's understanding of genetic counseling, because this is part of your 9.4 section B, right? 9.4 with respect to your physical anthropology. Now you can talk about what is the Harper's understanding of genetic counseling, and talking about that it is a process in which you bring in the awareness about the inheritance of diseases. About the inheritance, about the what is the threat perception that is existing with respect to the inheritance of different diseases. For you to understand or for you to be aware about what is the inheritance line, the pedigree analysis is used. This can be talked, right? Pedigree analysis. Here we have to talk about the different types of pedigrees that can be drawn with respect to your autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, right? All these aspects can be discussed with respect to this pedigree analysis. On a whole, this is a simple question, because when you look at genetic counseling, the identification part happens to be one of the stages of genetic counseling, and your pedigree analysis can be utilized with respect to identification part and also with respect to the information dissemination. This aspect can be seen, right? Next, it is asking about PRA and PLA, participatory rural appraisal and participatory learning and action. Now in our syllabus we know that we have RRA and PRA. From where are we getting this participatory learning and action? You need not be confused, because when you look at the continuum that happens to exist with respect to this particular understanding of your research methodologies, you see you have RRA. From RRA, the increased degree of participation, you would have PRA. With an increased degree of participation, we would have PLA, that is participatory learning and action. What is that? This is more to do with the applied section or the applied anthropology part. This is more to do with action anthropology. Here what we do is we not only increase the degree of participation, but we also talk about that how are we going to tackle that particular issue. Right, here we can bring in the case studies of the tribal developmental committees that were constituted under the individuals like Verrier Elvin, under the individuals like LP Vidyarthi, right? So those committees can be discussed, because in those committees such processes were developed, and you can bring in the integrated approach. Integrated approach of tribals can be interlinked with respect to such a kind of research methodologies that are generally used, right? Moving on to the choice questions and moving on to the sections, the second section or the second question. Here we see that they're asking about anthropology is a systematic, objective, and holistic study of humankind in all times and places. Now, in this question, elaborate the argument. In this question, the question is very, very straightforward. There's nothing much to be understood, because this question is asking about what is the diversity of the subject that is existing with respect to anthropology, and also in what all context you see a variation that is happening. Now, when we talk about this particular question, the fundamental understanding of anthropology is such that you see it is a detailed study of the biological, social, and cultural aspect of man. This is what we see. And when you look at this biological, social, and cultural aspects, you see that these biological, social, and cultural aspects of man will also have certain elements of variation. When we are discussing about biology or the physical anthropology, we see that it is part of your genetic, it is part of your medical anthropology. There are different sections that are present. So there is so much of variation that is existing. Apart from that, when you talk about this anthropology as a subject being systematic, we can talk about what are the different methods that are used. What are the different methods that are used? That might be the synchronic approach, that might be the diachronic approach, that is what is called as the historic approach, or that might be the comparative approach, or we can even talk about the Kenneth Pine's theory of the emic and etic view. Emic and etic view. See, all these are what? All these are making the subject systematic, making the subject objective, making the subject holistic, right? Which can be discussed, which can be talked, right? Because what happens is we have different methods and methodologies that are followed in order to understand the subject of anthropology. Here we can talk about the Hertzkowitz understanding of anthropology as a subject, and we can also talk about the Bolden's understanding of anthropology, where the K.E. Bolden talks about that anything under sun comes under anthropology. He talks about a broader understanding of anthropology, so that can be discussed here, right? Then moving on to the next question. Now when we move on to the next question, here we see that when we move on to the next question, it is asking about the discuss different forms of primate social organization. It is asking about the social organization with respect to the primates. Now here, the thinkers that are categorically to be used is Jane Goodall. You can talk about the Jane Goodall's observations, right? And when we talk about these different aspects with respect to the primate social organization, you would see that this primate social organization, they have number of activities that are involved with respect to the primate social organizations, number of activities, right? Now in this again, we have one more case study which can be talked about, that Pussy et al. Now Pussy et al. Observes about this particular social organizations, especially in Gombe National Park. And in this Gombe National Park, he observes that a female individual who is dominant among the groups of this particular primate will have higher survival rate with respect to the offsprings. So that is a kind of observation that is made by Pussy et al. Right? So such observations can be made. Now when you talk about the primate social organization, it might be with respect to the community living, it might be with respect to the power, it might be with respect to the territorial demarcations, right? All these aspects are going to come under the primate social organization. We have to talk about Jane Goodall as a thinker, very, very important for this, right? Next question. Discuss the suitable examples discuss the suitable examples, the typo-technological problems in the Indian Paleolithic industry with reference to environmental hypothesis. Now in this question, it is more of an analytical question. For the reason that they are not simply asking you about what is the Indian Paleolithic culture. They are not asking you about Indian Paleolithic culture, but they are asking about the typo-technological problems. And this typo-technological problems, and in this question, when you look at the context of this question, they are asking about what is this typo-technological problems vis-a-vis the environmental hypothesis. Because it is always a comment that is seen that Indian Paleolithic culture can neither be conceived chronologically homogeneous nor an uniform cultural phase. So, when you look at Indian Paleolithic cultures, you see that the chronology is also a miss, and the uniformity is also a miss. And this chronology and this uniformity is miss for the reason that they have certain problems that are existing with respect to the typotechnology. Right? And when you talk about typotechnology, it is nothing but talking about the tools and the corresponding technology and the tool technology. And when you look at the thinkers that are to be used in this particular question, you can talk about Robert Bruce Foote, you can talk about MLK Murthy, right? You can talk about MLK Murthy. And when you talk about the different kinds of classification that has been made by Robert Bruce Foote on the basis of your Abbevillian and Acheulean technologies, that can also be discussed here, right? And when we look at the certain problems that are existing, the major problems that are existing in this particular region, or the problem with respect to the Indian Paleolithic, is that there is an aspect with respect to the Indian soils being more acidic in nature, because they are asking about environmental hypothesis, Indian soils being more acidic in nature. And not only that, and whenever we are talking about the aspects with respect to the tools and the techniques, what happens is it is more of a destructive nature. It is more of a destructive nature of the techniques that are used in this particular era. So those aspects will come into the play, right? So this can be done. Okay. Then now please remember, here they are not asking about Paleolithic industry. They are indirectly asking about, when you look at the components here, you can talk about the Indian Paleolithic era. Then you can talk about what is the type of the technology that is used here. Then after that, you directly get into the problems vis-a-vis the environmental hypothesis. That context should not be mixed, right? Then moving on to the next question. When we move on to the next question, right? Discuss how the rules of descent. Discuss how the rules of descent. Discuss how the rules of descent contradict the principles of residence in matrilineal societies, mentioning suitable examples. Now here in this question, what are they emphasizing about? They are talking about, or they are trying to bring in a relation that is existing with respect to the rules of descent and the principles of residence. And what is the nature of the relation that they have given? That they are talking about contradiction. They are talking about contradiction and in matrilineal societies. When they are talking about this contradiction that is existing, it is fundamentally talking about that the neo-local societies, or it is talking about the ambi-local societies. The neo-local societies and the ambi-local societies, they are perceived to have the bilineal kind of inheritance. And whereas the patrilocal societies are going to have patrilineal, and whereas the matrilocal societies are going to have matrilineal. Now here, the debate that they are trying to bring in is with respect to the matrilocal societies also and avunculocal societies. That is the maternal uncle side. So this particular debate they are trying to bring in. And when you look at this kind of debate that they are trying to bring in, sometimes although it is avunculocal, it can be such that there can be a matrilineal descent. Although it is a matrilocal society, there can be with respect to your avunculineal descent. So here what is happening is that they are trying to bring in a conflict that is existing here, right? So in that aspect we need to bring in this question, right? Enumerate the evidences of animal domestication in the Indian microlithic industry. And when you look at this particular question, which is asking about the evidences of animal domestication in the Indian microlithic industry, it is microlithic is nothing but the Mesolithic era, right? Mesolithic period. Now when you talk about this Mesolithic period, because microlithic is the type of technology that was existing during Mesolithic cultures. And when you talk about this Mesolithic cultures, the fundamental understanding of Mesolithic culture, it is a transitionary period. And when you look at this transitionary period, it is a transitionary period with respect to that when you look at the Paleolithic culture and Neolithic culture, the transitionary period is Mesolithic. And when you talk about the Paleolithic culture, the fundamental understanding of Paleolithic culture, this is more food gathering kind of societies. Whereas when you talk about the Neolithic, these are food producing kind of societies. And when you talk about the Mesolithic, the transition that is seen is that these are more to do with the food collecting societies. food collecting societies. That might be with respect to the change in the environment, that might be with respect to the change in the glacial conditions that are present during a particular period of time, right? Now with that understanding, we also see that this becomes a kind of transitionary region with respect to the animal domestication as well. And when you look at this evidences of animal domestication, the evidences can be derived from, it might be the petroglyphs, the evidences can be derived from the cave art, the evidences can be derived from the nature of habitat that was existing during this particular period of time. The evidences of animal domestication can be derived from the painting. So we have to talk about what are the evidences that are existing. And once we talk about these, what are the evidences that are existing with respect to the animal domestication, then we have to talk about what are the different kinds of animals that were present. Enumerate the evidences, right? So the animals, the general animals that you see here, there is a kind of antelope species kind of things that were present. And we also have the dog domestication, right? Dog domestication, goat domestication, right? Please remember the camel domestication. Please remember there was no cow domestication during this particular period of time. That has to be kept in mind, right? In case if you're not aware about the what are the animals that were domesticated to a larger extent, but at least we should not be able to make this blunder about that cow is domesticated during this particular period of time, right? So with this understanding, you can write that slowly. Now, what is the important relevance that you can bring in with respect to this particular domestication? You see that this domestication of animals, the domestication of animals has enhanced the economic aspect. Has enhanced the economic aspect in which time period, especially the Neolithic time period, because where you see when you talk about the Neolithic time period, you characterized it to be an agricultural society, you characterize it to be a food producing society. And when you talk about this Neolithic culture, and you would see that there was this ploughing systems which started to emerge, and you would also talk about these animals being used as ploughing systems. So that kind of ploughing systems, that kind of animal usage in ploughing systems is fundamentally derived from this concept of animal domestication, right? That has to be discussed for the reason to make this answer look dynamic. Now moving to the next question, and when you talk about this question, they are asking about that should we still distinguish between the classical and progressive Neanderthals, discuss the controversy surrounding the Neanderthals' position in human evolution. And when you look at the concept of this Neanderthal, right, when you look at the aspect of Neanderthal, you would see this is that kind of transition you see from your Homo erectus onwards till your Homo sapiens. In the intermediate, you would come across this Neanderthals. And when you look at this Neanderthals, and when we look at the debate that is existing, the debate is of two types. The debate is of two types. One is with respect to the debate is centered around the position of the Neanderthal in the phylogeny. That is one aspect. The second aspect with respect to this is the categorization of Neanderthal. The debate that is persisting is should we at all categorize? Should we at all categorize? If should we at all categorize? If yes, and if no. What are the two things that are persisting with respect to this categorization? Okay, now one aspect with respect to position that the debate can be resolved by using the Skupin's evolutionary line. The Skupin's evolutionary line can be used to resolve this particular debate with respect to not only the resolution, but you can talk about at least betterment of the phylogeny or phylogenetic position of Neanderthal. Okay, and in the recent past, you would have been coming across with respect to the principles of crossbreeding that is persisting with respect to Neanderthal as part of the evolution towards the Homo sapiens. Okay, now when you talk about this categorization, one debate that you can talk about is the categorization with respect to classic and progressive. And when you talk about this categorization, we have to talk about the physiological variations. We have to talk about the physiological variation that might be with respect to the dentition, that might be with respect to the cranial features or post-cranial features. Those have to be discussed if at all we have to talk about distinguishing. And if at all we have to talk about non-distinguishing with respect to the classical and progressive Neanderthals, we have to say that there is so much of variation that is existing. There is so much of variation that is existing because among these two, only one, either among the classical or among the progressive, only one resulted in the moving up the evolutionary line. So one understanding is it doesn't become a substance of the classification, it doesn't become a substance of debate. That aspect can be brought in here, right? And moving on to the last question for the section A, and when we talk about the last question for section A, we see that it is asking about that why Heath and Carter used anthropometric measurements instead of using photographs to assess the somatotypes. Elaborate their method. They're asking about this. They're asking about Heath and Carter method. Because when you talk about this somatotyping as a philosophy, this somatotyping is all about what? The somatotyping is to analyze. And not only the analyze, it is also about quantify the human body forms. That means it is fundamentally talking about what are the morphophenotypic ranges that are present with respect to the individuals. Because what happens is when you try to understand these morphophenotypic ranges, these become an important aspect with respect to the growth studies. In this chapter we study also about growth studies, and when you talk about this growth studies, what you see, it might be the cross-sectional method, it might be the longitudinal method, or it might be with respect to the mixed methods. And such an understanding of somatotyping and such an understanding of objective nature of somatotyping can enable you to apply that knowledge in understanding or in bettering the growth studies, right? And when we look at this somatotyping, we have different types of somatotyping, or the different methods that are followed with respect to the somatotyping. And when you look at the different methods that are followed in the context of somatotyping, you see that those systems can be with respect to the Viola system. Those may be with respect to the Krushmer system. That may be with respect to the Sheldon system. And that can also be with respect to the Heath and Carter. And when you look at the general difference among all these four systems of usage with respect to the somatotyping, we see that the systems are getting better, we see that the systems are getting objective. For the reason that the Sheldon's method is more of an observational study. And not only that, when you look at the Sheldon's method, the one understanding with respect to Sheldon's method, it is more of a limited sampling method. So, as an advancement to the Sheldon, we have gone for the Heath and Carter's method. And when we look at the Heath and Carter's method, because now this Heath and Carter method transition, it is fundamentally based on the criticism for the Sheldon's method. So we have to talk about the criticism for Sheldon's method, as it is more subjective, as it is having limited sampling. Also, the criticism for Sheldon's method, it is that it has a negligence with respect to the role of environment that is present. Because when you talk about the qualitative studies or when you talk about the quantitative studies, we also have to talk in the consideration of role of environment. And there, you know that in the factor of heritability, there is an enabling variation that is existing with respect to a phenotypic and genotypic. All those elements have to be discussed, right? So the role of element is neglected in the context of Sheldon's method. And when we talk about the Heath and Carter method, it is talking about the evaluation of the physics at a particular given time. It is talking about the evaluation of physics at a particular time. And it is fundamentally based upon the measurements of what? Measurements of height, measurements of body weight, measurement of supraspinal skin fold, right? So all these aspects are considered with respect to the measurement. And when you look at the classification, they classify it as endomorphy. They classify it into three. Endomorphy, they classify into ectomorphy, and the other aspect is mesomorphy. So one aspect is endomorphy, mesomorphy and ectomorphy. And when we look at the difference, we know that the endomorphy is having a comparatively relative flatness and leanness of the individual's body. And when you talk about mesomorphy, we talk about relative muscular skeletal development. And when you talk about ectomorphy, it is more of a relative linearity. And when you look at the evaluation of Heath and Carter, the biggest advantage of Heath and Carter is it is more of a workable model. It is more of a workable model. And apart from that, it considers both spatial as well as temporal variation. And the advantage is it is very, very objective for the reason that it is all based on anthropometric measurements. Right? Anthropometric measurements. And here you can even talk about that what is the existing relation between, or what is the significance of this somatotyping. It might be with respect to bringing in the relation between a physic and the human function, or it might be physic and hormonal activity, or a corresponding physic and vis-a-vis what is the disease susceptibility of that kind of physic. So these aspects can be brought in, and if you have to bring in an applicative aspect to this particular question, you can talk about the kin anthropometry, the utility of the somatotyping in kin anthropometry, that is utility with respect to your sports, usage of sports, right? Next, discuss the historical and cultural context that lead to the superseding ethnocentrism with cultural relativism. Now here, this particular question is asking about the debate that was existing between the ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism, or ethnocentrism vis-a-vis cultural relativism. And when I talk about this concept of ethnocentrism, the W.G. Sumner's concept of in-group feeling and out-group feeling, this ethnocentrism as a phenomena has emerged, right? So, and this particular debate, the ethnocentrism vis-a-vis cultural relativism has been existing. And you see that Franz Boas happens to be one of the important individual with respect to such a kind of debate that has been existing. And you can talk about that what is this importance of the field work that has emerged in the context of Boasian era with respect to resolving of such a debate that has been existing. Straightforward question. The last question of your section A, critically examine the various anthropological interpretations about the colouring. Now, when you talk about this anthropological interpretations of colouring, now in this particular question, we need to talk about that when you look at colouring, now this is nothing but a form of ceremonial exchange, because your Kula exchange and your Urugubbu systems, they are part of your ceremonial exchange. There might be the exchange of your Mbali and Solova, that clockwise and anti-clockwise we discuss. So that aspect you can talk about the colouring. And when you look at the various anthropological interpretations, because they're asking for a critical examination, that anthropological interpretations can be the functional interpretation which is given by the Malinowski, the Argonauts of Western Pacific, which is given by Malinowski, right? In that aspect, you can talk about the functional aspect, its social significance, its economic significance, right? So what is the existing and what is the interpretative aspect of that? The second aspect that can be talked about is what is the symbolic aspect? What is the symbolic interpretation of colouring? It talks about the authority, it talks about the male domination, the symbolic aspect. The third aspect which is emerging in the recent past is talking about that what are the contemporary functional studies? What are the contemporary functional studies that can be seen with respect to this particular subject? Right? Contemporary functional studies about what? The colouring. The contemporary functional studies about colouring, the critical examination. Right? So these aspects you can talk about this particular section. Okay, and when you look at the structure of this discussion, we majorly emphasized upon what are the dimensions that have to be brought in and what can be the thinkers and what are the interrelations or what is the applicative aspect of this colouring, because you know that this is part of your generalized reciprocity. This colouring is more of a generalized reciprocity, something like this. So we are trying to interlink different concepts that are existing to bring in dynamism into this paper. Thank you.